Welcome back, listeners of Sci-Fi Stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently disabled monetization on our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting our hardworking team with just $1 so they can pay their living expenses and continue bringing these adventures to life. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the description and pinned comment. The sharp, sickening fracture of thick bone snapping echoed through the pristine training hall, instantly silencing the hum of the artificial gravity generators. A massive, bioengineered body slammed into the reinforced metal deck, entirely lifeless. Standing over the fallen giant was a 19-year-old boy from Earth, his breathing perfectly steady, his hands already raised in a calculated surrender. The galaxy was about to learn exactly why humanity was classified as a Deathworld species. Aegis Prime was the undisputed pinnacle of galactic military conditioning, a colossal space station suspended in the freezing dark of the Outer Rim. It was a place designed to forge the most elite peacekeepers in the universe. For Emmett Bundy, it was a gilded cage. At 19 years old, he was the youngest recruit on the station, and one of the very few humans ever permitted to join the ranks. To the ancient, highly evolved alien races that populated the Galactic Coalition, humans were an unpredictable anomaly. They called him a boy. They looked at him with a mixture of clinical curiosity and outright disgust. Every breath he took was monitored, every twitch of his muscles analyzed by overseers, waiting for the feral Deathworlder to inevitably snap. No one hated him more than Commander Vorlag. Vorlag was a Zyran biowarrior, a towering mountain of engineered muscle, scarred scales, and synthetic enhancements. To Vorlag, the inclusion of humanity in the elite forces was a political insult. He viewed Earthlings as primitive, emotionally volatile apes, whose only evolutionary advantage was unhinged brutality. He made it his personal mission to ensure Emmett would either wash out or be carried out in a body bag. The hostility reached its boiling point during a close-quarters combat simulation. The combat ring was a sealed, hexagonal chamber designed to simulate zero-gravity environments. The air inside was chilled to near freezing to keep the recruits sharp, smelling faintly of sterile ozone and old sweat. Emmett floated in the center, his muscles tense, waiting for the engagement signal. Outside the glass, Vorlag stood at the control console. With a cruel twist of his scaled hand, he bypassed the safety protocols. The heavy, mechanical clunk of the dampeners disengaging reverberated through the deck. This was no longer a training exercise. By shutting down the failsafes, Vorlag had transformed the arena into a lethal trap, deliberately turning a simple sparring session into a brutal physical torture meant to break the human recruit. "Show me what your primitive blood can do, boy," Vorlag snarled over the intercom, his voice a deep, vibrating rumble. The commander did not send in combat drones. He entered the ring himself. The moment the airlock sealed behind him, Vorlag broke every regulation in the instructor manual. He did not draw a training baton. Instead, he activated a lethal electrical surge in his bare, gauntlet-clad hand. The blue energy crackled, illuminating the icy vapor of his breath. With terrifying, blinding speed, the giant lunged. He threw an open-handed strike aimed directly at Emmett's face, an electrified slap designed to not only shatter the boy's jaw, but fry his nervous system entirely. It was an attack meant to humiliate, to swat the human down like a nuisance insect, while showing off the terrifying power of a Zyran elite. But Vorlag fundamentally misunderstood the creature he was attacking. Emmett did not cower. He did not freeze in terror. In the fraction of a second, before the lethal blow connected, the legendary survival instinct of a Deathworlder ignited. Time seemed to dilate. The human brain, forged in the chaotic, hyper-competitive biosphere of Earth, bypassed conscious thought entirely. Before the alien spectators outside the glass could even register the movement, Emmett reacted. He did not try to block the crushing force. Instead, he ducked by mere millimeters, feeling the static electricity singe the hair on his forehead. Using the zero-gravity environment to his advantage, Emmett grabbed Vorlog's massive wrist. He planted his boots squarely against the giant's armored chest. With a violent, explosive exertion of kinetic energy, Emmett used Vorlog's immense forward momentum against him. He became a fulcrum. Twisting his entire torso, the 19-year-old human executed a flawless, devastating joint lock, channeling the alien's colossal mass into a single, unbearable point of pressure right at the base of the Zyron's skull. The sound was a dry, hollow snap. Vorlog's thick cervical vertebrae gave way under the unnatural torsion. The electrical charge sputtered and died as the bio-warrior's brain disconnected from his central nervous system. The giant's eyes rolled back into his head. His massive frame went completely slack, drifting for a brief second before the artificial gravity kicked back in on an automatic emergency override. Vorlog hit the floor like a sack of wet cement. He did not move again. The training hall plunged into a suffocating, deathly silence. Dozens of alien recruits pressed their faces against the glass, their eyes wide with incomprehensible shock. A Zyron warlord, a veteran of 100 campaigns, had just been effortlessly slaughtered by a teenager from a dirt planet in less than 3 seconds. Inside the ring, Emmett Bundy slowly backed away from the corpse. His face was an emotionless mask of pure, predatory calm. He took a deep, measured breath, letting the icy air fill his lungs. Without a word of triumph, he smoothly raised both of his hands to shoulder height, palms open and facing the observation deck in the Universal Coalition posture of surrender. He stood completely still, his heart rate already dropping back to a resting rhythm, silently preparing his mind for the inevitable military tribunal. The hum of the electrostatic holding cell vibrated through the reinforced deck, a low and aggressive frequency that rattled the teeth. A cage of pure kinetic energy formed an impenetrable box in the center of the maximum security detention block, specifically calibrated to contain creatures of immense physical strength. Sitting perfectly cross-legged on the cold, sterile floor of his glowing prison, the human boy did not pace. He did not shout demands for legal counsel or plead his innocence to the automated security drones hovering outside the barrier. Instead, he closed his eyes, inhaling deeply for 5 seconds, holding the chilled air in his lungs for 5 seconds, and exhaling for another 5 seconds. He was manually overriding his own sympathetic nervous system, willfully forcing his spiked heart rate down to a calm, steady 60 beats per minute. Behind his closed eyelids, his hyper-vigilant brain endlessly replayed the chaotic fractions of a second leading up to the fatal encounter. He analyzed the memory with the cold detachment of a tactical computer. Something about the trajectory of the giant's arm felt fundamentally wrong. An open-handed strike meant to humiliate, concuss, or even break a jaw would naturally target the broad, vulnerable plane of the cheek. But remapping the spatial coordinates of the attacker's body in his mind, he realized the thick fingers had been angled downward, rigid, locked, and frighteningly precise. The intended point of impact had never been his face. The alien had been aiming dead center for his left carotid artery. 3 decks above the detention block, the primary medical bay was bathed in harsh, shadowless surgical illumination. The chief medical officer, a slender and highly perceptive avian scientist of the Corvian race, stood over the autopsy table, his slate-gray feathers ruffled in deep distress. The massive corpse lay stripped of its heavy combat armor. A medical drone hovered nearby, its scanning lasers washing back and forth over the grotesquely twisted neck. There was a glaring, horrifying anomaly presenting itself on the cold, steel table. Where the thick flesh had torn during the fatal, violent rotational motion, there was absolutely no pooling of dark, purple Zyron blood. Instead, a thick, highly viscous fluid was oozing slowly from the ruptured artificial veins. It was bioluminescent, glowing with a sickly, synthetic neon green light that cast an eerie, venomous pallor over the sterile white walls of the morgue. It smelled strongly of heavy metals, burned ozone, and synthetic polymers, completely devoid of the natural copper tang of organic life. "By the stars, this is impossible," the avian doctor whispered to himself, adjusting his multi-lens optical loops. He leaned closer to the severed cervical vertebrae, his beak nearly touching the glowing slime. "Drone, run a deep tissue carbon trace, full spectrum analysis, cross-reference with the Central Genetic Registry." The medical drone chimed softly, projecting a three-dimensional holographic data stream directly over the corpse. The scrolling results were profoundly chilling. The biological signature of the remaining organic tissues indicated severe, irreversible cellular necrosis that had been chemically masked by advanced preservatives. The being lying on the autopsy table had not died 2 hours ago in a combat ring. According to the absolute decay rate of the isolated organic matter, the real commander had been dead for at least 6 months. The hardened skin, the heavy scales, the familiar scarred face, they were nothing but an incredibly sophisticated bioengineered suit. The creature they had just brought into the morgue was a mimic Borg, an illegal, highly classified synthetic construct designed exclusively for deep cover infiltration and sabotage. The doctor's clawed hands trembled as he used a precision laser scalpel to carefully peel back the synthetic skin of the right gauntlet, the very hand that had attempted to strike the human recruit. Hidden deep within the artificial knuckles, perfectly concealed from standard weapon scanners, was a microscopic pneumatic injector. Loaded inside its pressurized chamber was a payload that made the chief medical officer's blood run completely cold. It was a biodigital neural parasite, resembling a metallic centipede, no larger than a grain of sand, equipped with microscopic neurobarbs. The entire training exercise, the overt hostility, the intentionally bypassed safety protocols, it had all been an elaborate, terrifying setup. The strike was never meant to kill the human. It was a targeted delivery mechanism. The physical impact would have driven the microinjector straight into the human's carotid artery, sending the parasite swimming instantly into his cerebral cortex. The unseen architects of this conspiracy wanted to hijack the human's lethal physical capabilities, turning him into an untraceable, completely mind-controlled sleeper agent, perfectly positioned to assassinate the highest-ranking leaders of the Galactic Coalition. Looking closely at the internal structural schematics projected by the drone, the doctor suddenly realized the sheer, blind luck of the human's defensive reflex. The devastating rotational force the boy had applied to the neck had done significantly more than just snap artificial bone. Hidden, running straight down the exact center of the synthetic spinal column, was the mimic's primary subspace transmission antenna, the critical uplink required to activate, calibrate, and remotely control the neural parasite. By breaking the neck in that exact location, the human had accidentally severed the primary transmission line, neutralizing a catastrophic psychological warfare operation before it could even begin. "Seal the medical wing," the chief medical officer shouted, his voice cracking with sudden, overwhelming panic as a new warning light flashed on the console. "Initiate a Level 1 automated quarantine lockdown. We have a breach." He was exactly 3 seconds too late. The violent severance of the internal antenna had silently triggered a latent, fail-safe deadman switch buried deep within the mimic's synthetic chest cavity. The neon-green bioluminescent fluid pooling on the table abruptly began to boil, bubbling violently as it rapidly superheated. A high-pitched, agonizing electronic squeal pierced the quiet air of the medical bay, rising exponentially in pitch and intensity. Before the doctor could even leap toward the emergency blast door controls, the corpse detonated. There was no massive ball of fire. There was no concussive shockwave of tearing metal and shrapnel. Instead, the chest cavity ruptured inward with a sharp crack, unleashing a highly concentrated, narrow-band electromagnetic pulse. The invisible, devastating wave of disruptive energy violently washed outward through the walls, instantly frying every delicate circuit, power relay, and processing core in its path. The holographic diagnostic displays shattered into white static and instantly died. The brilliant surgical lights popped simultaneously, raining a shower of bright sparks down onto the cold floor. The primary power grid of the entire medical sector overloaded with a heavy, mechanical groan and collapsed. The heavy security blast doors froze solidly in their tracks, locking tightly into place. Even the steady, comforting background hum of the station's massive atmospheric life support processors ground to a terrifying, absolute halt. The deafening silence that rushed in to fill the void was heavier than any physical weight. Within the span of a single, panicked breath, the pristine, high-tech environment of Aegis Prime was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. The electrostatic barrier hummed down to absolute zero, vanishing into thin air as the localized power grid failed completely. The heavy magnetic locks securing the holding cell disengaged with a dull, heavy thud. Emmett stood up from the cold floor. The corridor outside was plunged into pitch-black darkness. There were no emergency lights. The suffocating silence was instantly shattered by the distinct, rhythmic crunch of heavy combat boots echoing down from the upper decks. It was not the chaotic, stomping run of station security officers scrambling to respond to an emergency. It was the deliberate, synchronized, and highly trained march of a hostile breach force. They were moving in under advanced optical camouflage, utilizing the sudden blackout as their ultimate cover. The electromagnetic pulse had never been an accident. It was their precise green light to begin the operation. Screams began to ring out from the adjacent trainee barracks. The alien recruits were completely and utterly helpless. Species that had evolved under the bright, binary star systems of the inner core, or within permanently illuminated hypercities, lacked the fundamental biological hardware required for absolute darkness. Their highly evolved, delicate eyes were effectively blind, panicked by the sudden absence of photons. But humanity was born in the shadows of a hostile world. Emmett blinked slowly, feeling the pupils of his eyes dilate massively. The rod cells in his retinas, a biological gift from millions of years of nocturnal predators stalking his ancestors across the savannah, immediately flooded his brain with critical visual data. The absolute blackness slowly dissolved into a manageable, tactical canvas of deep grays, sharp silhouettes, and faint thermal outlines. He could clearly see them. Shimmering, water-like distortions in the air moved steadily down the hallway. The active camouflage of the mercenaries bent the faint, ambient starlight bleeding through the exterior structural viewports, but they could not hide their physical displacement. Emmett slipped out of his cell, his bare feet making absolutely no sound on the freezing metal deck. Up ahead, near the intersection of the secondary armory, two figures were backed into a corner, whimpering in terror. Emmett recognized them instantly by their thermal silhouettes. One was a fragile, four-armed Voil empath, and the other was a dense, reptilian Drac engineer. Approaching them were three shimmering distortions, raising silenced kinetic rifles to execute the blind recruits. Emmett did not hesitate to formulate a plan. He did not waste time looking for an energy blaster. He dropped into a remarkably low crouch and lunged forward like a coiled spring. He crossed 20 feet of open space in total, terrifying silence. His bare hands found the first mercenary in the dark with pinpoint accuracy. A swift, brutal strike to the side of the throat crushed the alien windpipe before a single alarm could be broadcasted over their comms. As the second mercenary spun around, confused by the sudden drop of their squad mate, Emmett swept their heavy legs out from under them. He caught the dense kinetic rifle as it fell from their grip, spinning it in his hands, and used the heavy reinforced stock to cave in the tactical visor of the third attacker in one fluid, merciless motion. Three elite, cybernetically enhanced combatants lay dead on the floor in under 6 seconds, completely dismantled by primitive, kinetic human violence. The vile empath collapsed against the cold bulkhead, shivering violently. As a naturally gifted empath, she instinctively extended her mind to gauge the emotional state of their unseen rescuer, fully expecting to find the raging, chaotic bloodlust of a Deathworlder completely unhinged by the slaughter. Instead, what she touched in his mind made her physically recoil in pure astonishment. There was absolutely zero fear. There was no anger, no panic, and absolutely no malice. There was only the icy, terrifying stillness of an apex predator at work. His mind was a perfectly organized vault of calculated geometry, sensory input, and lethal intent. He was not a monster reveling in violence. He was a silent hunter, systematically clearing a threat to protect his newly adopted pack. It was a profound level of psychological control she had never felt in any known civilized species. Emmett crouched down and quickly stripped the tactical datapad from the wrist of the fallen squad leader. The reinforced screen was cracked, but still functional, shielded against the pulse by military-grade casing. He bypassed the basic biometric lock by physically pressing the dead mercenary finger against the scanner. The tactical orders, scrolling down the screen, glowed with a harsh, damning red light. This was not a rescue mission for the exposed mimic, nor was it a simple station takeover to secure hostages. The holographic schematics highlighted a direct, uncontested path down to the deepest engineering decks. Their objective was the primary quantum core. The encrypted operational manifest detailed a precise sequence to disable the magnetic containment stabilizers and initiate a cascading quantum overload. But the target vectors were not set to detonate the explosion in empty space. The massive navigational thrusters of Aegis Prime were pre-programmed to align the station trajectory directly toward the Sol system. They were going to turn the entire multi-trillion credit installation into a relativistic kill vehicle and hurl it straight at Earth. Before Emmett could explain the grim reality of the situation to his terrified squad mates, the air pressure in the corridor suddenly dropped with a sickening pop. The artificial gravity generators shuddered violently. The sharp, hissing sound of massive atmospheric vents sealing shut echoed off the metallic walls. The mercenaries had seized the central life support hub and purged the oxygen mix from the outer residential sectors to quickly suffocate any remaining resistance. The Drac engineer immediately began to gasp, clutching his thick, scaled chest as his high metabolism lungs desperately searched for life-giving air. The Vol slumped sideways against the wall, her forearms trembling, already on the verge of losing consciousness. Emmett took a long, slow breath. The air was thinning incredibly fast, growing heavy and thick with carbon dioxide. For the alien species accustomed to perfectly scrubbed, hyper-oxygenated, and climate-controlled environments, this sudden deprivation was a guaranteed death sentence within a few short minutes. But Emmett was a child of Earth. His lungs had been organically forged in the thin, heavily polluted atmospheres of the outer mining colonies, adapted over harsh human generations to survive in the most toxic, unforgiving slums of known space. While the highly evolved aliens choked and gagged on the dead air, Emmett merely felt a familiar, almost comforting burn deep in his chest. His unique physiology seamlessly shifted into an anaerobic conservation state, slowing his metabolism and hyper-oxygenating his blood. He had at least 3 times longer to operate in this suffocating, freezing void than any hostile alien currently breathing on the station. "Stay here," Emmett whispered down to the gasping recruits, his voice barely a dry rasp in the rapidly thinning atmosphere. "Do not make a sound. I am going to the core." He turned around and vanished completely back into the pitch-black shadows, a ghost hunting in the dark, leaving the 2 terrified aliens to marvel in silence at the terrifying, indomitable resilience of the human race. Emmett secured the heavy blast door of the secondary maintenance locker, sealing the vile empath and the Drac engineer safely inside a reinforced compartment. It would hold them securely and conserve what little breathable atmosphere remained in that localized section. He did not say goodbye. He simply turned his back and propelled himself down the access shaft, moving silently into the sprawling, multi-tiered chamber of the central quantum core. The gravity plating in this sector had been entirely disabled by the mercenaries, leaving the massive cylindrical room suspended in absolute zero gravity. At the dead center of the chamber, illuminated only by the harsh crimson glow of emergency battery lights, a squad of heavily augmented hostiles floated around the primary command console. They were rapidly inputting the complex mathematical algorithms required to weaponize the station. Their optical camouflage armor made them nearly impossible to track by conventional means. To the naked eye, they were nothing more than subtle ripples in the air, bending the ambient light around their bulky frames like heat mirages on a desert highway. An automated defense drone or an alien targeting computer would require a full 60 seconds to calculate and lock onto their shifting visual displacement. Emmett did not have 60 seconds. He also did not possess a targeting computer. He had something far older and far more effective. Drifting silently along the outer catwalk, Emmett located a heavy chemical fire suppression station, bolted to the bulkhead. He forcefully ripped the manual release lever, bypassing the electronic lock. He grabbed the large pressurized canister, pointed the nozzle directly into the open air of the core chamber, and depressed the trigger. A massive, thick cloud of fine, dry chemical retardant powder exploded outward. In the zero-gravity environment, the fine white dust did not settle to the floor. Instead, it expanded rapidly, filling the vast space with a floating, particulate fog. The advanced optical camouflage of the mercenary armor was designed to bend light, but it could not alter physical matter. The moment the microscopic dust particles hit the invisible soldiers, the powder clung to the microscopic grooves of their stealth suits. Where they moved, they displaced the thick cloud, carving out perfectly visible, human-sized negative silhouettes in the white fog. The ghosts were suddenly given shape. Before the mercenaries could adapt their visual sensors to the sudden chemical cloud, Emmett struck. He did not engage them in a direct, honorable firefight. He utilized the terrifying, predatory calculus of his ancestors, launching a relentless guerrilla campaign of hit and run. The massive alien mercenaries, standing nearly 8 feet tall and weighed down by heavy kinetic armor, were incredibly lethal in open space. But the engineering architecture of Aegis Prime was laced with incredibly narrow thermal exhaust pipes, ventilation shafts, and tight crawl spaces designed exclusively for small, automated maintenance drones. Emmett weaponized the claustrophobic geometry of the station. He slipped inside the dark, narrow tubes where the giants could not follow. He would burst out from a ventilation grate behind a floating hostile, executing a brutal, silent joint lock to snap a knee or crush a throat, and instantly propel himself backward into the shadows before the others could return fire. He was a phantom made of flesh and bone, a terrifying blur of kinetic energy striking from impossible angles. 3 more mercenaries fell to the lower containment deck, their tactical visors shattered, their biological forms broken by a creature less than half their size. The heavy static of the internal public address system suddenly crackled to life. The mercenary commander, a towering synthetic hybrid, had patched his comms into the localized emergency speakers. His voice echoed through the vast, dark chamber, dripping with mechanical arrogance and cold contempt. "You are delaying the inevitable, little Deathworlder," the commander sneered over the speakers, the sound bouncing off the metallic bulkheads. "Your biological parameters are failing. Your lungs are burning. You are composed of frail, carbon-based tissue, driven by irrational fear. We have absolute technological superiority. Our armor cannot be breached by your primitive hands. Our thermal optics see the heat of your rapidly beating heart through the walls. You are a biological error, fighting against perfection. Bleed out in the dark, human. Emmett did not waste oxygen on a verbal reply. The commander was relying entirely on his advanced sensor suites, completely trusting the digital data fed directly into his optical cortex. Emmett knew that technology, no matter how advanced, always possessed a fundamental physical flaw. Clinging tightly to a dense cluster of utility pipes directly above the primary command console, Emmett located the main high-pressure coolant valve that circulated super-chilled water around the quantum core. Using a jagged piece of scrap metal stripped from a broken drone, Emmett manually hacked the mechanical pressure lock. He violently wrenched the heavy steel wheel counterclockwise. Thousands of gallons of highly pressurized, freezing water erupted from the ruptured pipe. The geyser blasted straight down, directly striking the exposed, superheated exterior housing of the reactor core. The violent collision of extreme cold and immense heat caused an instantaneous, catastrophic physical reaction. The water vaporized in a microsecond, detonating into a massive, blinding explosion of superheated steam. The expanding steam cloud was deafening. It released a shrieking, ultrasonic physical shockwave that violently rattled the heavy armor of the mercenaries. More importantly, the sudden, overwhelming burst of ambient heat completely blinded their tactical visors. The advanced thermal and infrared sensors, designed to track the subtle body heat of a single human, were instantly overwhelmed by the massive wall of white-hot vapor. The screens inside their helmets flashed a blinding, agonizing red before short-circuiting entirely. Total sensory deprivation consumed the mercenary squad. In the chaotic, blinding whiteout of the steam explosion, Emmett dropped straight down from the ceiling. He landed squarely on the shoulders of a blinded, heavily armored hostile, wrapping his legs around the alien throat to snap the neck, while simultaneously ripping the heavy kinetic pulse rifle directly from the mercenary grip. He kicked off the falling body, spinning weightlessly through the scalding steam. He aimed the heavy weapon not at the roaring commander, nor at the remaining panicked soldiers firing blindly into the fog. Emmett calculated the exact trajectory, leveled the heavy barrel, and fired 3 consecutive bursts of ionized plasma directly into the delicate, exposed thermal exhaust vents of the quantum core. The heavy energy sinks shattered into 1,000 pieces of molten slag. Red warning sirens immediately began to scream over the intercom, drowning out the mercenary commander. With its primary cooling mechanism violently destroyed, the central processor of the quantum core instantly registered a critical, catastrophic temperature spike. To prevent a localized nuclear meltdown, the ancient, hard-coded safety protocols of the station forcibly overrode all manual inputs. The mercenary countdown sequence was instantly terminated. The massive system initiated a mandatory, unhackable station-wide emergency reboot, plunging the tactical board back to zero. The Predator had just outsmarted the machines. The emergency protocols finalized their cycle. Deep beneath the deck, the massive physical relays engaged with a deafening metallic crash. The artificial gravity suddenly stabilized, yanking the floating debris, the cooling steam, and the lifeless bodies of the mercenaries violently down to the grated floor. A split second later, the harsh, brilliant white LED panels of the primary lighting array flickered to life, banishing the shadows from the vast quantum core chamber. At the far end of the massive room, the heavy, reinforced blast doors were blown off their hinges. Dozens of heavily armed coalition peacekeepers poured into the chamber, their tactical energy shields raised and their kinetic rifles scanning for targets. Leading the extraction force was General Kalin, the supreme commander of coalition security. He was a towering, elegant figure of the Lumina race, adorned in pristine, ceremonial white armor that contrasted sharply with the blood and grime of the battlefield. Emmett dropped the heavy mercenary rifle he had taken earlier and slowly raised his bare hands, expecting a standard medical extraction. Instead, 4 peacekeepers rushed forward, violently tackling the exhausted human to the deck and clamping heavy magnetic restraints around his wrists and ankles. "Execute the human traitor immediately," Kalen commanded. His voice was perfectly smooth, utterly devoid of any emotional fluctuation or shock at the carnage. The peacekeepers forcefully racked their weapons, leveling the glowing barrels directly at the back of the human boy's head. Emmett looked up from the cold floor, his sharp eyes locking onto Kalen's perfectly composed face. The realization hit the young recruit like a physical blow. The sudden, catastrophic blackout. The perfectly timed arrival of an elite mercenary strike force. The incredibly expensive, highly classified synthetic mimic. A random hostile warlord or a pirate faction could never orchestrate a breach of this magnitude. It required Supreme Command level clearance to bypass the automated orbital defenses. Kalen was not the rescue party. Kalen was the architect. The general held up a single, slender hand, pausing the execution squad for a brief moment. He stepped closer to the restrained boy, looking down with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. "You look confused, human," Kalen said softly, pacing a tight circle around Emmett. "Do not take this personally. It is the simple, brutal arithmetic of galactic evolution. The Coalition has observed your volatile species for 200 years. You are a terrifying paradox to civilized life. You built weapons of mass destruction before you cured your own diseases. You thrive in toxic, irradiated environments that would melt the flesh right off our bones. We allowed humanity into our elite ranks, hoping that socialization and strict discipline would tame your savage nature. It did not. We realized your military potential is a sleeping leviathan. I could not, in good conscience, let humanity infect the civilized stars and eventually conquer us." Kalen gestured gracefully toward the shattered remains of the quantum core cooling vents. The original design was quite elegant. The neural parasite within the mimic was meant to permanently override your aggressive cortex. You would have returned to the High Council on Capital Prime, assassinated the prime ministers with your own bare hands, and provided my administration with the perfect political justification to glass your home planet from orbit. We would have wiped Earth from the star maps in the name of galactic peace. The general sighed, looking with disdain at the broken bodies of the invisible mercenaries scattered across the deck. But your raw, savage reflexes ruined the narrative. You broke the mimic before the parasite could be delivered. So, we adapted. A catastrophic quantum overload, destroying our most prestigious academy, with the blame falling squarely on a rogue, psychologically unstable human recruit. The entire galaxy would weep for our fallen children, and they would demand the absolute eradication of the Deathworlders. A small, necessary sacrifice to preserve the cosmic order. Emmett strained violently against the heavy magnetic cuffs, his muscles bulging under the artificial lights. "You are just a frightened bureaucrat hiding behind a uniform," Emmett spat out, his voice dripping with venom. "You are terrified because you know we are better survivors than you will ever be." Kalen smiled coldly. He tapped a rapid encrypted sequence on his wrist gauntlet. A localized gravity singularity projector dropped from the ceiling, directly locking onto Emmett's coordinates. The atmospheric pressure spiked instantaneously to 10 times the standard galactic pull. The immense, crushing weight slammed Emmett flat against the metal deck. The air was violently forced from his lungs in a ragged gasp. The thick steel panels beneath him groaned and buckled under the intensely concentrated strain. "Let us see if your primitive, carbon-based skeleton can withstand the pure physical force of a collapsing star," Kalen whispered, watching the human boy struggle to draw a single, agonizing breath under the immense pressure. But the Supreme Commander had made a fatal, arrogant miscalculation. He had vastly underestimated the very bonds he sought to destroy. Hidden deep within the secondary maintenance locker on the upper deck, the alien recruits Emmett had saved were not passively waiting for death. The vile empath had extended her mind through the thin bulkheads, anchoring her consciousness to the human to monitor his survival. She had felt the arrival of the security forces. She had felt the overwhelming, malicious intent radiating from the general. Through her unique telepathic connection, she had captured every single word of Kalen's arrogant monologue. The Drac engineer, utilizing his unparalleled technical brilliance, had bypassed the localized jamming field and patched her neural frequency directly into the station's surviving emergency communication relay. They were not just listening to the execution, they were broadcasting it. The pure, unedited neural recording of the Supreme Commander, confessing to high treason, attempted genocide, and the murder of his own Academy recruits, was currently streaming live across every single public and military communication channel in the entire galaxy. The truth was out, and the abyss was staring right back at Kalen. The heavy blast doors of the quantum core vibrated as the localized communication array broadcasted the Supreme Commander's treason to every ship, outpost, and civilian terminal across the galaxy. Kalen stared at his personal datapad, watching his secure political empire crumble into dust in real time. The flawless, elegant facade of the Lumina General shattered into pure, rabid panic. "Kill the transmission!" Kalen shrieked, his pristine composure entirely gone. He frantically punched a hard-coded sequence into his armored wrist gauntlet, bypassing all safety protocols. A terrifying mechanical siren began to wail throughout the station. The core containment fields began to collapse manually. "If I cannot save the Coalition from you savages, I will erase this entire sector. You have 60 seconds before this station becomes a miniature sun." Emmett was pinned flat against the deck under the localized gravity singularity. 10 times the normal gravitational pull of Earth squeezed his chest. The dense carbon fiber of his tactical suit groaned. Beneath his skin, the human skeleton was pushed past its absolute breaking point. A sickening crack echoed from his ribs. To any alien species in the galaxy, this was the end. Their biological systems would simply shut down to prevent further agony. But Earth had not bred quitters. Earth had bred survivors. Deep inside Emmett's adrenal glands, an ancient, primitive chemical reaction ignited. Pure, undiluted adrenaline flooded his bloodstream. It was the evolutionary trump card of a Deathworlder, an emergency biological override that turned off pain receptors and pushed muscular output well beyond theoretical limits. His heart hammered against his broken ribs like a war drum. Emmett dug his bare, bloody fingers into the grated steel floor. He gritted his teeth, his jaw locked in pure, feral determination. Slowly, impossibly, the boy began to push himself up. The elite peacekeepers in the room froze in absolute horror. They were watching a biological impossibility. The human was fighting against a gravitational force that would flatten a heavy combat rover, yet he was rising to his knees. The blood vessels in his eyes burst, painting his sclera a terrifying, demonic red. With a final, explosive roar of pure human defiance, Emmett forced his body to stand completely upright. He broke the fundamental laws of physics through sheer willpower. The soldiers were completely paralyzed by the terrifying spectacle. They did not raise their weapons. They simply backed away from the monster they had awakened. Emmett did not reach for a blaster. He lunged forward through the crushing gravity field like a bullet leaving a chamber. He closed the distance to Kalen before the Supreme Commander could even register the movement. Using the very momentum of the gravity well, Emmett locked his hands onto Kalen's raised wrist. He twisted his entire torso, applying a devastating terrestrial tactical arm lock. Bones snapped like dry twigs. Kalen screamed in agony as his arm bent entirely backward. Emmett ripped the gauntlet free, smashing his bloody thumb onto the abort command sequence. The wailing sirens abruptly cut off. The harsh red emergency lights faded back to standard white. The digital display on the broken console flashed brightly, freezing on exactly 3 seconds. The gravity singularity failed, dropping Emmett heavily to his knees. He gasped for air, clutching his shattered ribs. Kalen lay on the floor beside him, cradling his ruined arm, his pristine white armor stained and cracked. The general looked up at the teenager, his eyes wide with trembling disbelief. "Why?" Kalen choked out, spitting blood onto the deck. "You are a beast, a savage. You had every reason to tear my throat out. Why let me live?" Emmett wiped the blood from his eyes. He looked down at the broken general with absolute, freezing contempt. "Because we learned how to fight, so we never have to become monsters like you," Emmett replied quietly. The aftermath of the Aegis Prime incident forever altered the political landscape of the cosmos. The galactic tribunals were swift and merciless. Kalen was stripped of his rank, his crimes broadcasted for all of history to judge, and he was sentenced to absolute exile. Earth was not purged from the stars. Instead, the terrified coalition recognized the undeniable truth. Humanity was not a mindless threat. They were the ultimate shield. Earth was officially elevated as a primary pillar of galactic defense. Months later, the massive training halls of the newly rebuilt academy hummed with the energy of 100 different species. A new class of elite recruits stood in perfect formation. Standing before them was a human instructor. He bore a jagged, terrible scar across his neck, and his right arm was heavily supported by a mechanical medical brace. Emmett Bundy looked out at the young, fearful faces of the alien cadets. He did not yell. He did not threaten them. He simply raised his good hand, demanding their silent attention. "Your physical strength means absolutely nothing without the mind to control it," Emmett said, his voice echoing clearly across the hall. "Today, we do not learn how to strike. Today, we learn the greatest weapon in the universe. We learn the power of restraint." A new era had dawned in the galaxy, led by the unbreakable spirit of a single human boy. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the very end of our story today. Where in the world are you listening from? Please let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this cosmic journey and want to help keep our channel alive, please consider supporting our hardworking team with just $1. Your kindness helps our creators feed their families and ensures we can keep bringing you even better stories in the future. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by using the PayPal link in the description and pinned comment. Thank you for believing in us, and we will see you in the next adventure.